Star Wars Communication Breakdown. It was 1 month since the dreaded Death Star was destroyed. It dealt a serious blow to the Empire. The Senate was dissolved, and the one weapon to keep the balance of power was destroyed, and more planets were now beginning to slip out of their grasps, declaring open rebellion against the Empire. Now the Rebel Alliance was getting more and more stronger. Now we are at Yavin 4 as Princess Leia was briefing a small group of rebel soldiers, including Luke Skywalker, on the operation they were about to go on. She says to them in the briefing, "Gentlemen, this is Saurian Major. It was one of the first planets to join the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And after the end of the Clone Wars, it resisted the Empire for a small number of years before the Empire went in with typical efficiency and butchered half of the population, and the rest it shipped off to work camps. And right here, gentlemen, is the target we're going after," she says, as a picture on the display screen shows some sort of base. She says, "Gentlemen, this is the communication complex. Right here is where all major communications for the Empire is received, the signals boosted, and then sent all over the place in the Empire. Our mission is to destroy this complex. Without this complex, the Empire will be deaf and blind." And she goes on to explain, and there has been a small resistance group there for over a decade that have been fighting the Empire down there, waging guerrilla warfare within the jungle. We established contact with them 2 years ago, and we aided them in sending weapons and supplies to them. We're going to try to gain contact with them down there, and they will help us to raid the complex and destroy it. And then the princess concludes the briefing with saying that Captain Solo has agreed to take us down there. Luke thought in his mind, "Oh boy, I wonder how she convinced Han to do this job." Soon the princess boarded the Millennium Falcon with Luke Skywalker and the small group of rebel soldiers. Well, the door shuts and the Millennium Falcon takes off. During the ride there, Luke Skywalker was sitting in the cockpit behind Han, and Han says to Luke, "I don't know why I do this, kid. I don't know why I volunteered." Then Luke says to Han, "Because you're a wonderful human being." And then Chewbacca lets out a few growls, and he says, yeah, I maybe have a soft spot for the princess." Then Han goes on to say to Luke, "Well, congratulations on your promotion, kid." Luke says, "Yeah, thanks, Han. I'm kind of nervous being a captain at my age." Then Han says, "Nonsense, kid. You earned that promotion. You know, there's people who get up the ranks by kissing butt, and there's people who get up the ranks from hard work and determination like you did. That's a well-earned promotion," says Han. Luke says, "Thanks, Han, old buddy." Then he hears Princess Leia over the comm saying, "Luke, can you get back in the back? I have to do a quick briefing." Luke gets up and leaves the cockpit. He sits with the other soldiers, and then Princess Leia begins her quick briefing, and she says to the soldiers, "I'm sorry, fellas, I kind of forgot a very important information during the briefing on Yavin Base." And she says the flora on Saurian Major are carnivorous. They have a taste for flesh. And then she goes on to say that the last survey determined that these plants may have a certain degree of intelligence. And she says to them, "Please, fellas, be very careful on that planet with any plants that are nearby." After the quick briefing by the princess, the guy that Luke was sitting next to quickly recognized him, and he says, "Wait a minute, you're Captain Luke Skywalker, the guy who destroyed the Death Star." Luke was like, "Yeah, I am that guy, he says. Then the man that started talking to him introduced himself, and he says, my name is Mike Restall. I joined the Rebel Alliance last year, he says, and I was formerly a thief, a lockpick. I know all kinds of locks, physical and electronics. And then Luke says, well, it's good to meet you, Mike. Then Han's voice is heard overhead on the ship saying, we're about to drop out of hyperspace. Everyone fasten yourself in. Well, everyone fastened themselves, and the Millennium Falcon dropped out of hyperspace. Princess Leia goes into the cockpit, and she looks out the window and sees the planet Sari Major. It had a rosish, sepia kind of color to it. And then Han says, I made a few runs out here in the past. There are plenty of places where one could hide a ship, he says to her. And then Leia says to Han, any place where you could land the Falcon close enough to the complex? Han says, not really. It will still be a good mile or two trek to the complex if I find a landing spot nearby. Then Leia says, well, that'll do. Then eventually the Falcon enters the atmosphere of the planet and does find a nice landing spot that was only a mile away from the complex. So the small group of soldiers, led by Princess Leia, depart from the Falcon. Joining them also was Han and Chewie. As they trek through the gravelly hillsides, they were far away from the jungle, but the hills had some sparse vegetation, weird-looking flowers that were growing. Mike touched one and quickly jerked his hand away, and he says, oh God, that thing is like warm and clammy. Then Luke says, Mike, don't touch it. We don't know if it was one of the man-eaters. Mike says, you don't have to tell me a second time. Well, they made it to the area near the communication complex. They found a nice little valley where they could hide. They set up camp, and Princess Leia gives instructions to the men where to be hiding out at, and the plan was to leave Luke out in the open just in case one of the fighters were around, or just in case there was a stormtrooper patrol and they could easily ambush him. Well, Luke started a campfire and just sat there. It was a bit on the chilly side on the planet's surface. And, of course, the others were in hiding. Mike tells one of the soldiers where they were hiding at. Well, at least we're away from any plants that have designs for us. And the soldier says to Mike, yeah, you're right about that. Well, Luke Skywalker was all alone by the campfire. Suddenly, he was attacked. Someone kicks him, and he goes falling onto the ground. He quickly looks up. It was a young woman, and she had a blaster rifle with her. And she asked Luke, who are you? But she was not speaking with her mouth. She was speaking to Luke telepathically. Luke realized that she was probably force sensitive, and he responded back telepathically, I'm Luke Skywalker. How can you talk through telepathy? And she noticed Luke's lightsaber, and she says to him telepathically, that's a Jedi lightsaber. You're too young to be part of the Order. And Luke said to her verbally, it belonged to my father. It was given to me by my former master who died last month. Suddenly the young woman hears the noise of gravel falling. When she was distracted, Luke quickly kicked the rifle out of her hand and got back up and wrestled her to the ground. Then he runs over to her rifle and picks it up and points it to her, and she says to Luke telepathically, I hope you die alone and in pain. Luke says to her verbally, I'm not your enemy. We're not your enemy. Then he pulls the gas clip out of her rifle and gives her back her rifle as a sign of good faith and that he was a friend. And Luke also extended his hand to help her up from the ground. And then she says to Luke, who are you with? And then Luke answers her back, I am with the Alliance to Restore the Republic, the Rebel Alliance for short. And we came here to destroy that huge communications complex. We were looking for a band of resistance fighters here. Then they heard more rustling of gravel, and it was Princess Leia who was walking towards them. And she says to the young woman, I take it you're with the resistance here. The woman says yes and no, and then she proceeds to introduce herself. My name is Jem. I fought with the resistance here for a while before they all died. Leia's like, what? How? Then Jem proceeds to tell the story how it happened. She says to Luke and Leia, well, I came here 3 years ago. I've been fighting in other resistance groups before then, but then I heard that these people needed help, so I came here, and with my experience, I was able to organize them a lot more than they were, and thanks to you all in the Rebel Alliance supplying us with supplies and weapons, we were starting to become a major threat to them. Major enough that they thought to wipe us all out at once. And she goes on to explain, I was underground manning the communications equipment when it happened. They filled the air with a poisonous gas, and all the resistance fighters died. Since I was underground, I was not affected, but I sensed something was wrong, and I went up, and it was all over. They were all dead, and I'm the only survivor. Then Leia's like, my god. Then Luke gives her back her gas clip. She puts it back into her rifle. Then she quickly points her rifle to where she heard a noise in the not too distant part of where they're at. And it was Chewie as he was letting out a growl. And there was Chewie with Mike. And Mike says, whoa, whoa, don't shoot, pretty lady. And then she hears from the other end another noise. It was Han Solo with a gun pointed at her. And he says to her, you were dead the minute you broke your cover, sweetheart. I had a gun trained on you the whole time. Then Jem raises up her rifle and she says to Luke and Leia, more friends of yours? Leia says yes. We were expecting a lot more of you, but from what you told us, now I have to rethink the strategy on how to take down that communications complex. Later on, the night had fallen, and everyone was back at the Millennium Falcon. As Princess Leia was thinking of a new strategy, Luke was talking to Jem, and Jem was telling Luke everything he wanted to know about the old Jedi Order. And she goes on to explain how she survived the Purge. And she tells Luke, well, Luke, I was 10 years old at the time when the Purge happened. And she goes on to explain, I was at the theater that night. Me and several other Padawans who were also 10 years old were taken to the theater by one of the librarians in the Jedi Temple by the name of Master Nora Enseem. She was a great and lovely woman, and she took us to the theater that night to watch a play. And it was kind of a tradition. We all got to see a play because we're all going to be very busy soon. At 10 years old, a Jedi Padawan was assigned to a knight to complete his or her training. She says to Luke, I was too excited to really pay attention to the play. I was wondering who was going to be the Jedi Knight I would be assigned to. I was keeping my fingers crossed and hoping that I would be assigned to the most popular Jedi who was making waves in the media. His name was Anakin Skywalker. Luke's eyes light up and he says to Jem, Jem, that man was my father. Jem was surprised and she says, wow, you're the son of Anakin Skywalker. I wonder how that could be. And then she goes on to explain to Luke, see, Luke, in the old Jedi Order, no Jedis were allowed to marry or have children. Even though there were a few rule breakers, and there were also several Jedis who were allowed to have families under certain circumstances, like former Jedi Council member Mundi, who was allowed to marry and have a family due to the low birth rate of his race, she says. And then she says, well, back to the story I was saying. Then she goes on to explain, well, we were at the theater that night, and I do remember feeling a very bizarre sensation. It was very troubling. All us Padawans and our master felt it. She tells us to stay seated and gets up. And what felt like an eternity, she finally comes back and tells us all telepathically to stay quiet and just leave our seats in a single file line. She took us to a Jedi safe house within the theater district. And there we stayed, and we found out the terrible fate that happened to the Order. I'll admit, all of us were scared. We didn't know what was going to happen, but Master Nora was a pillar of calm in the storm that was going on, says Jem. And then she continues to explain to Luke what happened. Then it happened. Master Nora secured transport for all of us. The safe house was well stocked with food and credits just in case. And she used those credits to pay for a transport. And we all were taken back to our respective homeworlds where we were found on. Me, I was born in Sereno, so I was taken back to Sereno and given back to my parents, and she told me to forget about everything. Don't mention about the Jedi, don't mention about being force sensitive, just keep quiet and act normal, she says to me. And then that was the last time I ever saw her. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't keep quiet. My parents were still kind of upset about me being taken away when I was a very little child, and also were upset that, I was being trained as a Jedi. They did not like the Jedi, especially with the false propaganda that was being spread by the Empire that we tried to kill the Emperor, and we were the ones that instigated the Clone Wars. And then she continued to explain to Luke, I know where I'm not wanted at, so I knew it was time for me to leave. By then I was 12 years old. And I ran away from home, and I met the Sereno Underground. They were an underground resistance movement that were fighting the Empire on Sereno. And she says they were all former members of the Separatist movement. Then she says to Luke, I trained with them, and I fought alongside them. And I eventually started moving around with other resistance groups until I ended up here. Then Luke says, wow. And then he tells his life story to her. And then she remarks to Luke, Obi-Wan Kenobi, I remember him very well. You are very fortunate to have trained with him, although it was brief, but you're also very lucky to have him as a good friend, she says to Luke. Then Leia comes up to the two of them and she says, sorry Luke, I have to borrow your new friend for a moment. We have to start planning this attack. Well, it was near dawn, and Leia was having another briefing. She informs them of the new plan of attack, since now they did not have the help of the Saurian Major rebels. She goes on to say, Han, Chewie, you stay on board the Millennium Falcon. That way you can come and pick us up when we're ready to get out. And then she tells the small group of soldiers, you fellas will be doing a small attack out in front to distract them. And then she says that Jem is going to help us to get into the complex. She knows of a way in, and it will just be me, her, Luke, and Mike. And then she goes on to explain the operation, and she says, we're going inside and we're going to overload the main power generator. That way when it blows up, it's going to blow up the entire compound. At the same time, we're going to knock out the turrets and the security system so that the Millennium Falcon could fly in and extract us all safely, she says. And then she tells everyone dismissed and get ready. Well, it was dawn, and the small band of soldiers were there, and they launched their little attack. A small battle ensued outside in the front of the complex, while Luke, the princess, Mike, and Jem run inside to the compound, coming in through the secret entrance that Jem knew about. Well, they make their way to the control room for the turrets, and Luke proceeds to do some wiring and take down the turrets. And then they make their way to the other control room where the sensors were, and Luke does some fancy wiring, and he takes down the sensors, and he says to the princess, well, now they won't be able to pick up the Millennium Falcon coming in, they won't be able to fire at it either. And then Leia says, excellent, now let's get to the power generation room. So they snuck around the base until they made their way to the power generation room, but they were picked up, and one of the stormtroopers was ready to open fire, but Jem used her force push, sending the stormtrooper flying over the railings down to his death. Luke was amazed. It's like, wow. But then they hear the intruder alert alarm go off. Then Leia turns to Mike and she says, Mike, get this door open quickly. Well, more stormtroopers show up at the end of the hall and a small firefight ensues in the hallway. Finally, Mike gets the door open and they quickly run inside. Then Mike shuts the door and says to the rest of the group, well, we're trapped like rats in here, so I wonder how we're going to get out. Luke surveys the power room and he says, I'm going to cut a way out for us while you guys get this thing to overload. Then Luke reaches for his lightsaber and activates it. Then Luke stabs his lightsaber into the wall in the back of the power room and starts to slowly cut the wall, making a way out. Of course, as he was doing that, him cutting the wall drew the attention of the stormtroopers on the other side of that wall, and they're all waiting to shoot who was ever going to come out of there. While that was going on, Jem proceeds to the main generator. She goes to the base of the generator and pulls out a control board. And she says, well, let's see. Here's the regulator. And here are the emergency and auxiliary regulators that kick in just in case the main one and the others deactivate. So she pulls out the auxiliary regulator and tosses it to the ground and crushes it by stomping on it with her boot. Then she pulls out the emergency one and repeats the action. And then finally she pulls out the main regulator and crushes it under her boot. And then she puts the control board back into the base of the generator. And soon they could see that the energy was building up to the point of overload. Luke says, the wall's cut, but I'm going to need everybody's help to push it open. Then Jem says, hold on a second, Luke. She goes up to the cut wall and uses force push, and the piece of wall goes flying back, taking out the stormtroopers that are waiting to attack and killing them as that piece of wall hit the wall on the other end of the hallway. Then Jem turns around and she says to the others, go, I'll stay here in case they come through the door and try to shut down this reactor. They're not going to win, she says. Leia's like, what? You're going to stay behind and sacrifice yourself? But we're in bad need of people like you in the rebellion. Jem says to the princess, I know, but it ends here for me. I only did this to avenge my fallen friends, she says to the princess, and then she goes on to say, I was going to do this attack before you all had arrived, but with the extra help, it just made it a lot easier, she says. Now, go, so I can join my friends in the Force, she says to the princess. Well, Mike, Luke, and Princess Leia go through the cut opening and run down the hall. Leia pulls out her comm, and she says, Han, pick us up out in front. Soon, Han starts the Millennium Falcon and flies off to pick them up. And she also informs the soldiers over the comms that the Millennium Falcon was coming right up, and as soon as it landed or opened its doors, retreat to it. Well, the three ran down the hall as they could hear now that the intruder alert alarm changed to the evacuation alarm. Meanwhile, back inside the power room, the main doors opened up, and Jem used a Force Lightning to get rid of the stormtroopers that were trying to come in. There were still some brave stormtroopers trying to make their way to the power room to shut down the fusion generator before it goes critical, but Jem was successfully fending them off between using her force power and using her blaster rifle. Well, as Leia, Luke, and Mike were running through the outside of the base, it was a ghost town. The fighting outside stopped as everyone had fled the base. Well, the three of them ran right through the front gate without any problems. They see the Millennium Falcon coming in. It did not land. It just got very low, low enough so that the doors could open up and everyone could run inside. Well, the soldiers were the first one inside, followed by Luke, Leia, and Mike. Soon as they were inside, the door shut, and Leia says in the intercom, Han, get us the hell out of here now! Then the Millennium Falcon quickly flies off full speed. Back inside the communications complex, Jem successfully fended off the remaining stormtroopers that wanted to shut down the overloading fusion generator, and then she telepathically says to Luke, Luke, it was nice meeting you. May the Force be with you. Then she turns to look at the generator as it completely overloaded and exploded. It was over. The mission was a success. As Han set the coordinates back to Yavin Base, Luke just sat at the chess table thinking about Jem, and he was joined by Leia, and he looks at Leia, and Leia says to him, Luke, I'm sorry that you lost your new friend. I feel sad that we lost a hell of a fighter, she says to Luke. Luke says, well, it's war, Leia, and these things are going to happen, he says to her. And then he goes on to say to Leia, well, at least I got to learn a lot from her in the short time we spent together, and I'm very thankful for that, he says to Leia. And Leia says, well, you're right, Luke, but I wish she didn't sacrifice herself like that. We could have used someone of her experience to probably be a ground commander, says Leia. Then Luke says to Leia, don't worry, more and more planets are joining our cause every day, he says to her, and I'm sure there's going to be plenty of experienced people joining the rebellion. Leia lets out a smile and she says, you're right, Luke. Then Luke says, challenge you to a game of chess? Leia says to Luke, you're on, and she activates the holo table. Like and subscribe, the end.